The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty blinds of my childhood bedroom, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor that creaked with every step. The air hung heavy with the scent of lavender and antiseptic, a combination that had become all too familiar over the past 6 months as I'd spent countless hours caring for my dying mother. I could hear the rhythmic hum of the oxygen concentrator down the hall, a sound that had become the soundtrack to our family's final chapter. What I'm about to tell you is absolutely true and will leave you speechless. Please like and subscribe. Tell me which city you call home. My name is Margaret Morris. I'm 61 years old, and I thought I knew everything about my family until the day I found those papers hidden in my sister's purse. The manila envelope was tucked beneath her prescription bottles and tissues, but the corner stuck out just enough to catch my eye when she asked me to grab her reading glasses. My hands trembled as I pulled out documents that would shatter everything I believed about the woman who raised me. The living room felt smaller than usual that Tuesday evening, filled with the weight of unspoken tension. My sister Diane Crawford sat in the worn velvet armchair that had been our father's favorite, her silver hair pulled back in the same tight bun she'd worn for decades. At 64, she'd always been the organized one, the one who handled paperwork and appointments with military precision. But there was something different in her pale blue eyes that night, a guardedness I'd never seen before. "Margaret, we need to discuss Mother's arrangements," Diane said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of authority she'd used since we were children. She adjusted the stack of papers on her lap, and I noticed how her fingers lingered protectively over the edges. My son, David Morris, had driven over from his apartment across town, still wearing his construction company uniform, the fabric dusty from a long day of work. At 35, he had his grandfather's broad shoulders and gentle manner, always the peacekeeper in our family disputes. He settled onto the floral couch beside me, his work boots carefully placed on the newspaper Diane had spread across the carpet. "Grandma's been asking for you again, Mom," David said softly, running his calloused hands through his dark hair. She seemed confused earlier, kept talking about papers she needed to sign. The words sent a chill down my spine, but before I could respond, the front door opened with its familiar squeal. Betty Henderson stepped inside, her arms laden with grocery bags and that warm smile that had been a constant in our lives for over 20 years. She lived 3 houses down and had become more than a neighbor after her husband passed. Her gray curls were disheveled from the October wind, and she wore the bright yellow cardigan I'd given her last Christmas. "I brought soup and fresh bread," Betty announced, her voice echoing through the small house. "Thought you girls might need something warm on a night like this." She paused in the doorway to the living room, her sharp green eyes taking in the scene before her. Betty had always been perceptive, able to read the mood of a room within seconds. The aroma of homemade chicken soup filled the air, mixing with the lingering scent of the roses from Mother's garden that Diane had cut that morning. Outside, the wind rattled the old windows, and I could hear the neighbor's dog barking in the distance. The house felt simultaneously too quiet and too loud, every sound amplified by the tension that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. "What's all this about arrangements?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mother had been declining rapidly over the past month, but we'd avoided talking about the inevitable. She'd raised Diane and me in this very house after our father died when I was 12. Working double shifts at the textile factory to keep us fed and clothed. Diane's jaw tightened, and she glanced toward the hallway where Mother's bedroom door remained closed. "The lawyer came by yesterday while you were at the grocery store. Mother wanted to make some changes to her will." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the distant hum of traffic on Maple Street. David shifted beside me, and I felt his hand briefly touch my shoulder in comfort. Betty had gone still in the doorway, her bags of groceries forgotten as she sensed the gravity of the conversation. Changes? The word came out strangled, barely recognizable as my own voice. For 6 months, I'd been the one sleeping on the uncomfortable cot beside Mother's bed, monitoring her medications, helping her to the bathroom at 3 a.m. I'd taken a leave of absence from my job at the library, using up my savings to cover the bills that kept piling up. Diane visited on weekends, bringing flowers and staying for exactly 2 hours before claiming she had other obligations. The house groaned around us as the evening wind picked up, and somewhere in the walls, a pipe clinked softly. The familiar sounds of home felt foreign now, as if the very foundation of everything I'd known was shifting beneath my feet. She wanted to be fair, Diane continued, but her voice wavered slightly. She thought about everything very carefully. David leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. What kind of changes, Aunt Diane? Betty finally moved from the doorway, setting her bags on the dining room table with deliberate quiet. She'd been present for countless family dinners, birthday celebrations, and holiday gatherings in this house. She knew our history, our struggles, and our deep bonds. The look she gave me was filled with concern and something else I couldn't quite identify. The envelope in Diane's lap seemed to grow larger, more ominous as the shadows deepened around us. Mother's breathing was audible from her room, labored but steady, the sound that had become my constant companion. I'd learned to distinguish between her comfortable sighs and the gasps that meant I needed to adjust her pillows or call the hospice nurse. "Margaret," Diane said, and the way she spoke my name made my stomach clench with dread. "Mother has decided to leave the house and her savings to me. She feels that since I've been handling her finances and legal matters, it makes the most sense." The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment, the room spun slightly. The floral wallpaper seemed to blur, and the familiar scent of home suddenly felt suffocating. David's sharp intake of breath was audible, and Betty's footsteps stopped abruptly in the kitchen. One small detail blew the whole thing open. "Handling her finances?" The words tumbled out before I could stop them. "Diane, you live 3 states away. I've been writing her checks, balancing her checkbook, and dealing with the insurance companies for months." Diane's fingers tightened on the envelope. "Well, yes, but I've been consulting with her financial advisor, and we thought it would be more efficient if I—" "Financial advisor?" I stood up so quickly that David reached out to steady me. "What financial advisor? Mother banks at First National with Mrs. Henderson, the same woman she's dealt with for 20 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Mother's labored breathing from the next room seemed to pause. Betty appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, a dish towel in her hands, her expression troubled. "Diane?" Betty said quietly. "What's really going on here?" My sister's face flushed, and she looked down at the envelope as if it held all the answers. Mother was confused sometimes. She didn't understand the complexities of estate planning. I found someone who could help her make better decisions. Better decisions? David's voice was sharp now, no longer the respectful tone he'd been using. "Aunt Diane, Margaret has been here every single day. She quit her job to take care of Grandma. She's been paying for groceries and medications out of her own savings." "I've been sending money," Diane protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "How much money, Diane? Because the account Mother usually pays her bills from has been nearly empty for weeks. I've been covering everything." Betty moved closer, settling into Mother's favorite reading chair. Margaret, remember last Tuesday when your mother seemed so upset after her nap? She kept saying something about papers she'd signed that didn't feel right. The memory hit me like a slap. Mother had been agitated, more confused than usual, muttering about making a mistake. I'd attributed it to the pain medication, the way it sometimes made her thoughts fuzzy and disjointed. When did she sign this will, Diane? My sister's hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Last Tuesday. The advisor came by while you were at the pharmacy picking up her prescriptions. David stood up abruptly. You brought a stranger into this house to pressure a dying woman into changing her will while her primary caregiver was away? It wasn't pressure, Diane snapped, but her defensive tone betrayed her. It was a practical decision. Margaret doesn't understand financial planning. She works at a library, for heaven's sake. I have experience with investments, with managing assets. Assets? I could barely speak. She's our mother, Diane, not a portfolio. Betty leaned forward in the chair. Diane, I was here last Tuesday. I brought soup for lunch, remember? Your mother was crying after that man left. She told me she felt like she'd betrayed Margaret, but that you'd convinced her it was for the best. The room fell silent, except for the steady tick of the clock. Outside, a car passed by on Maple Street, its headlights briefly illuminating the curtains before disappearing into the darkness. Diane opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, we heard Mother's voice from the bedroom, weak but clear. Margaret, I need to tell you something important. I rushed to Mother's bedside, my heart pounding. She looked so small against the white pillows, her face pale, but her eyes more alert than they'd been in days. The others followed behind me, crowding into the doorway of the bedroom. I'm here, Mother, I whispered, taking her frail hand in mine. Her fingers squeezed mine with surprising strength. I made a terrible mistake, Margaret. That man Diane brought, he kept talking so fast, using words I didn't understand. I got confused. Diane pushed forward from the doorway. Mother, you were lucid. You understood everything we discussed. No. Mother's voice was firm despite its weakness. I kept asking for Margaret, but you said she was busy. You said I needed to sign right away, or there would be tax problems. Her eyes filled with tears. I never wanted to leave you with nothing, sweetheart. You've given up everything for me. David moved to stand beside me, his presence steady and reassuring. Grandma, what exactly did you think you were signing? Diane said it was paperwork to make things easier for Margaret later. Something about avoiding probate. Mother's breathing was labored, but she continued. She said Margaret would still get everything she needed, just in a different way. Betty stepped closer to the bed, her expression gentle but determined. I remember now. After that man left, you asked me if daughters were supposed to take care of each other. You seemed so worried about doing the right thing. Diane's face had gone red. I was trying to protect our family's assets. Margaret doesn't understand how these things work. Don't. I turned to face my sister, feeling a surge of anger I'd been suppressing for weeks. Don't make this about my intelligence or my career. This is about you manipulating a sick, dying woman. Mother struggled to sit up higher. Margaret, in my jewelry box, there's a folded paper under the velvet lining. I wrote something down after that man left because I was afraid I'd forget. David helped steady Mother while I went to her dresser. The jewelry box was an old wooden one that had belonged to our grandmother, its corners worn smooth from decades of use. I lifted the velvet lining and found a piece of paper covered in Mother's shaky handwriting. What does it say? Betty asked softly. I unfolded the paper, my hands trembling. She wrote down everything she could remember about the conversation. It says here that Diane told her the original will was legally problematic and that I would face huge tax bills that would force me to sell the house anyway. "That's not what I said," Diane protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I continued reading. Mother wrote that she asked to wait for me to come home, but Diane said there wasn't time. The advisor told her that if she didn't sign that day, the government could freeze all the accounts. David's jaw tightened. "That's completely false. Grandma, none of that was true." Mother's eyes never left my face. "I knew something felt wrong. That's why I wrote it down. I was going to ask you about it, but then I got so sick yesterday." Betty sat on the edge of the bed and took Mother's other hand. "You were protecting Margaret the only way you knew how. But honey, you were given false information?" The weight of what had happened settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Diane stood in the corner, no longer the confident take-charge sister who'd walked in an hour ago. She looked smaller somehow, caught between her justifications and the reality of what she'd done. "I thought I was helping," Diane said quietly. "The money, this house, Margaret's never been good with financial decisions." "That wasn't your choice to make," I replied, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "And you don't get to decide what I'm capable of handling." Mother squeezed my hand again. "Margaret, I want to fix this. Tomorrow, can you call our old lawyer? The one who helped us when your father died? Mother, you don't have to worry about any of this right now. You need to rest." "No, sweetheart. I need to make this right." She looked toward Diane with an expression I couldn't quite read, sadness mixed with disappointment. "I need to know that you'll be taken care of after I'm gone, the way your father and I always planned." David cleared his throat gently. "Grandma, it might not be that simple. If the new will was signed under false pretenses, there might be legal steps we need to take." Betty nodded thoughtfully. "But first, we need to understand exactly what was signed and whether it can be challenged." Diane suddenly straightened, a new tension in her voice. "You can't prove I said anything improper. It's your word against mine, and Mother was on pain medication. Any lawyer will argue she wasn't competent to make major decisions anyway." The callousness of her statement hung in the air like poison. Mother's face crumpled, and I felt something fundamental shift in our family dynamic. This wasn't just about money anymore. "Diane," I said carefully, "are you threatening us?" Before she could answer, Mother's grip on my hand tightened with surprising urgency. "Margaret, there's something else. Something I never told you about what happened the day your father died." The room fell completely silent. Even Diane's defensive posture seemed to freeze as we all processed Mother's words. The weight of whatever secret she'd been carrying for years was etched in every line of her face. "Mother," I said gently, "you don't have to talk about Dad if it's too difficult." "No, Margaret, I should have told you this long ago." Mother's voice grew stronger, more determined. "The day your father died, he made me promise something about Diane." Diane stepped closer to the bed, her earlier bravado replaced by uncertainty. "What are you talking about?" Mother looked directly at her. "Your father knew about the gambling, Diane. He knew about the debts, the credit cards, all of it." The admission hit like a physical blow. Diane's face went white. "How could he have known? I never told anyone." "Because he co-signed that loan you took out 3 years ago," Mother continued, her voice steady despite the obvious pain. "The one you told him was for home improvements. When the bank called him about missed payments, He found out what it was really for. David leaned forward in his chair. Grandma, you don't have to do this now. Yes, I do. Mother squeezed my hand. Your father made me promise that when the time came, we'd make sure both of you girls were taken care of, but that Diane's inheritance would be put in a trust. He was worried that if she got a lump sum, she'd lose it all and have nothing left. Diane's voice came out as barely a whisper. Dad knew? He loved you, sweetheart. That's why he wanted to protect you from yourself. Mother's eyes filled with tears. But after he died, I couldn't bring myself to set up the trust like he wanted. I thought maybe things had gotten better, that you'd worked through your problems. I felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. That's why you were so upset when Diane mentioned gambling debts at Christmas. It wasn't new information. Mother nodded. I realized then that your father had been right, but I still didn't know how to handle it. I didn't want to hurt Diane, but I also didn't want to fail your father's wishes. Diane sank into the chair David had vacated, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. So, when the lawyer came yesterday, you thought this was your chance to do what Dad wanted? I thought if I left everything to Margaret, she could help you the way your father envisioned. But I should have talked to both of you first. I should have explained what your father had asked me to do. The room felt charged with years of unspoken truths and misunderstandings. I looked at Diane, seeing her not as the manipulative sister who'd tried to steal my inheritance, but as someone who'd been carrying her own burden of shame. Diane, I said carefully, why didn't you just tell us you were in trouble again? We could have helped. She laughed bitterly. Help? Margaret, you barely speak to me unless it's about Mother or holidays. And every time we do talk, I can see the judgment in your eyes. The successful daughter looking down at the screw-up. David shook his head. That's not fair, Mom. Aunt Margaret has never said anything like that. She doesn't have to say it, Diane replied. It's in every conversation about my job, my apartment, my choices. So yes, when I heard that lawyer talking about Mother's assets and her concerns about competency, I thought maybe for once I could take control of my own situation. Mother struggled to sit up straighter. Diane, what exactly did you tell the lawyer about me? The question hung in the air, and I watched my sister's face cycle through several emotions before settling on resigned honesty. I told him you'd been having memory issues, that you sometimes got confused about finances, and that Margaret lived too far away to help with day-to-day decisions. Diane's voice grew smaller with each word. I said I was worried about your capacity to make major decisions and that the family thought it would be better if someone local was handling things. But none of that was true, David said, his young voice carrying a note of disbelief. Grandma's been sharp as a tack through this whole illness. I know, Diane whispered. I know it wasn't true. But I was desperate, and when he mentioned that families often have these concerns, it felt like he was giving me an opening. Mother closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with a look of profound sadness. Oh, Diane, what have you done? Before anyone could respond, we heard the front door open downstairs, followed by heavy footsteps on the stairs. A man's voice called out, Mrs. Henderson, it's Attorney Johnson. I have those additional documents we discussed. The sound of Attorney Johnson's voice from downstairs sent a jolt through me like ice water. In that moment, the weight of everything we just discussed crashed down with terrifying clarity. Here we were, finally getting to the truth, finally understanding each other. And now, the very lawyer Diane had misled was walking back into our lives. I watched my sister's face drain of all color. Her hands began to shake visibly, and she pressed them against her legs as if trying to hide her panic. But there was no hiding from this. Whatever additional documents he'd brought, whatever conversations he'd had with Diane about Mother's supposed incompetence, it was all about to come to light. Mother's eyes darted between Diane and me, and I could see her mind working despite her physical weakness. She was putting together the full picture of what Diane's deception might mean, not just for our family relationships, but potentially for her legal standing, her autonomy, everything she'd worked to maintain during these final months. "Mom, what do we do?" David whispered, his earlier maturity giving way to the uncertainty of someone who'd just realized the adult world was far more complicated than he'd understood. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the lawyer's continued calls. "Mrs. Henderson, I wanted to review the competency concerns your daughter mentioned. I've brought some additional assessment forms." Competency concerns. Assessment forms. The words hit me like physical blows. This wasn't just about money or inheritance anymore. Diane's lies had potentially set in motion a legal process that could strip Mother of her right to make her own decisions in her final weeks. The woman who'd raised us, who'd been lucid and thoughtful through every conversation about her illness and wishes, could be declared incompetent based on fabrications. I felt a surge of protective anger, unlike anything I'd experienced. This was my mother, who deserved dignity and respect, not legal challenges to her mental capacity because my sister was drowning in debt. But as I looked at Diane, hunched over in her chair like she was trying to disappear, I realized my anger wouldn't solve anything. We needed clear thinking and honesty, and we needed it immediately. "Diane," I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible, "you need to tell me exactly what you said to him, every detail. Because when he walks through that door, we need to know what we're dealing with." "I told him you sometimes repeated yourself," she said in a rush, the words tumbling out like a confession. "That you forgot to pay bills, that you got confused about dates and appointments. I said Margaret lived too far away to notice how bad it had gotten, and that I was worried about people taking advantage of you." Mother's face showed a mix of hurt and disbelief. "Diane, I've never missed a bill payment. My mind is clear." "How could you say those things?" Because he kept talking about how families often don't recognize cognitive decline, and how important it was to protect elderly people from making decisions they might regret. Diane's voice cracked. "I thought if I could just get control of things temporarily, I could fix my situation and then make sure you were taken care of properly. I thought I could make it right." The lawyer's voice was getting closer, and I could hear him speaking to someone, probably talking on his phone while he waited. Time was running out for us to figure out how to handle this mess. David spoke up suddenly, his voice carrying a determination that surprised me. "Grandma, when he comes in, you just need to be yourself. Show him that everything Aunt Diane said was wrong. You're not confused or incompetent. Anyone who spends 5 minutes with you can see that." It was such a simple observation, but it cut through my panic. David was right. Mother was alert, articulate, and fully capable of demonstrating her mental competence. The lies Diane had told would crumble in the face of reality. But the damage to trust, the legal complications, the questions about undue influence, those wouldn't disappear so easily. "Mrs. Henderson?" The lawyer's voice was right outside the door now. "May I come in?" Mother straightened in her bed, and I saw her summon reserves of strength I hadn't known she still possessed. "Yes, Mr. Johnson, please come in. I think we have quite a bit to discuss." As the door handle turned, I realized we were about to face the consequences of Diane's desperation head-on, and I had no idea if our family would survive what came next. Mr. Johnson entered the room with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to handling delicate family situations. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with kind eyes that immediately took in the scene. Mother sitting upright in bed, Diane huddled in the corner chair, looking miserable. David standing protectively near the foot of the bed, and me hovering somewhere between defensive and apologetic. "Mrs. Henderson," he said warmly, approaching Mother's bedside. "How are you feeling today?" "I'm dying, Mr. Johnson, but my mind is perfectly clear," Mother replied with characteristic directness. "And I understand there's been some confusion about my mental state." I watched his eyebrows raise slightly. This wasn't the confused, easily manipulated elderly woman Diane had apparently described. Mother's voice was steady, her gaze direct, her posture alert despite her obvious physical frailty. "I see." He glanced around the room, taking in our faces. "Perhaps we should discuss the changes you wanted to make to your will. I have to admit, after our phone conversation yesterday, I expected to find you in quite a different state." Diane made a small sound, almost like a whimper. David moved closer to her chair, and I realized he was struggling between loyalty to his mother and recognition of how wrong this all was. "Mr. Johnson," Mother continued, "I need you to understand something. The person you spoke with yesterday does not accurately represent my condition or my wishes. I am fully competent to make my own decisions, and I have not asked anyone to speak on my behalf." The lawyer set his briefcase down slowly, his professional composure shifting to something more careful and alert. "Mrs. Henderson, are you saying that the concerns raised about your cognitive function were inaccurate?" "Completely inaccurate," Mother said firmly. "And I believe my daughter Diane has some explaining to do." All eyes turned to Diane, who looked like she wanted to crawl under the chair. David's face showed a mixture of embarrassment and growing understanding of just how serious his mother's actions had been. "Mom," David said quietly, "you need to tell him the truth." Diane's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I lied about Mother's condition because I'm in financial trouble, and I thought if I could just get temporary control of her affairs, I could fix everything and take care of her better." The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Johnson's expression shifted from professional concern to something approaching alarm. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was potential fraud, elder abuse, legal misconduct. "Ms. Patterson," he said carefully, "are you telling me that you deliberately misrepresented your mother's mental state in order to influence changes to her legal documents?" Diane nodded miserably, tears streaming down her face. "I'm going to lose my house. I owe money I can't pay. I thought if I could just handle Mother's finances for a little while, I could figure something out. I wasn't going to hurt her or steal from her. I just needed time." David sank into the chair beside his mother, his head in his hands. "Mom, do you have any idea what you've done? This isn't just lying to the family. You've lied to a lawyer about Grandma's mental capacity to try to change legal documents. This could be criminal." I felt a strange mix of vindication and horror. Vindication that the truth was finally coming out. Horror at realizing how desperate Diane had become and how far she'd been willing to go. But more than anything, I felt sad for David, watching his mother's actions potentially destroy not just our family relationships, but possibly her freedom. Mother reached out and took my hand. "Margaret, I want to be very clear about something. My will remains exactly as it was. I am not making any changes, and I do not want anyone else making decisions about my care or my finances." Mr. Johnson was taking notes now, his earlier warmth replaced by careful professional distance. Mrs. Henderson, given what's been revealed here, I need to recommend that you consider whether you want to pursue this matter legally. Attempting to manipulate legal documents through false claims about someone's mental competency is a serious matter. The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Diane's quiet crying became the only sound, and I realized we'd moved far beyond sibling rivalry or inheritance disputes. We were now dealing with potential criminal charges against my sister. "What happens now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Mr. Johnson looked around the room gravely. "That depends on what Mrs. Henderson wants to do, and whether anyone else decides to report this matter to the authorities." The silence stretched until Mother finally spoke, her voice steady but tired. "I need some time to think about this." She looked directly at Diane, who was still crying quietly. "I need to understand not just what you did, but why you felt you couldn't come to me for help." David lifted his head from his hands. "Grandma, she lied to a lawyer. She tried to manipulate legal documents. How is there anything to think about?" "David," Mother said firmly, "that's enough. Diane is still my daughter, and you're talking about your mother." I watched this exchange with fascination and growing unease. Even now, even after everything Diane had admitted to, Mother was trying to protect her. Part of me admired her loyalty, but another part worried she was being too forgiving. Mr. Johnson cleared his throat. "I understand this is a family matter, but I have professional obligations here. Mrs. Henderson, I strongly recommend you speak with someone about the legal implications of what's been disclosed today." "I understand," Mother said. "Could you give us some time alone to discuss this?" After Mr. Johnson left, the four of us sat in the heavy quiet of the aftermath. Diane had stopped crying, but kept her head down, unable or unwilling to look at any of us. "Mom," David said finally, his voice gentler now, "talk to us. Help us understand how it got this bad." Diane raised her head slowly. "After your father died, everything fell apart financially. The medical bills, the funeral costs, then the house repairs. I kept thinking I could handle it, that I'd find a way to catch up." Mother leaned forward. "Why didn't you tell me? You know I would have helped." "Because you were already helping Margaret with her house down payment and David with his student loans. I didn't want to be another burden." I felt something shift in my chest. "Diane, I never knew you were struggling. You always seemed to have everything together." "That was the point," she said bitterly. "I've spent so much energy pretending everything was fine that I couldn't admit when it wasn't anymore." David moved to sit on the arm of his mother's chair. "Mom, we're family." "You don't have to pretend with us." "Don't I?" Diane looked around at all of us. "Margaret's the successful one with the career and the savings. You're the smart one getting your education. I'm just the one who made bad choices and married the wrong person." Mother shook her head. "That's not how I see any of you." "But it's how I see myself," Diane said. "And when the bills kept piling up, when I realized I might lose the house, I panicked. I thought if I could just manage Mother's finances temporarily, I could use some of the money to stabilize my situation, then pay it back before anyone noticed." The honesty was brutal, but I found myself understanding her desperation in a way I hadn't expected. "But then you realized it wasn't that simple," I said. Diane nodded. "The lawyer started asking questions I couldn't answer convincingly. I got scared and thought if I could just redirect the inheritance, I'd have more time to figure something out." David stood up and began pacing. "Mom, You do realize what you're describing is theft, right? Even if you plan to pay it back eventually? I know that now, Diane whispered. I know I've messed up everything. Mother struggled to stand, and I quickly moved to help her. She walked slowly to Diane's chair and sat on the arm, much as David had done moments before. Diane, look at me, she said softly. When Diane finally met her eyes, Mother continued. I'm going to help you with your financial problems. But you're going to help me understand exactly what legal trouble you might be in. Mother? I interrupted. Are you sure that's wise, after what she tried to do? Mother turned to me with surprising sharpness. Margaret, I've watched this family drift apart over the years, everyone thinking they had to handle their problems alone. I won't let that continue. David stopped pacing. But Grandma, what about the legal issues? Mr. Johnson seemed pretty serious about that. We'll figure that out together, Mother said. All of us. I felt torn between admiration for Mother's loyalty and concern that Diane was manipulating her again, even now. But looking at my sister, seeing her genuine shame and fear, I found my anger beginning to shift into something more complicated. Diane, I said carefully, if we're going to help you, we need complete honesty. No more lies, no more manipulation. Can you promise that? She nodded, tears starting again. I promise. I'm so tired of lying. Mother patted Diane's shoulder. Good. Now, we need to understand exactly what Mr. Johnson might be required to report, and what we can do to protect you while still making this right. David sat back down, looking overwhelmed. This is way bigger than I thought it would be when I asked Grandma about the will. I realized he was probably feeling guilty for starting this whole confrontation. David, you did the right thing asking. If you hadn't, who knows how much worse this could have gotten. But even as I said it, I wondered if we were already past the point where this situation could be contained within our family. Mr. Johnson's warning about his professional obligations echoed in my mind, and I had the sinking feeling that regardless of what we decided, the choice might no longer be entirely ours to make. The silence stretched between us as the weight of our situation settled in. Mother remained perched on the arm of Diane's chair, her hand still resting protectively on my sister's shoulder. I found myself studying this tableau, trying to reconcile the woman who had just admitted to attempting fraud with the little sister I remembered teaching to ride a bike. We need to be practical about this, I said finally. Mr. Johnson mentioned reporting requirements. We should assume he'll have to disclose what happened here today. David leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. What does that actually mean, though? Like, will there automatically be charges filed? I don't know, I admitted. That's the problem. None of us really understand the legal implications. Diane wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I looked into it when I first started having the money troubles. There are different levels of consequences, depending on whether actual fraud occurred or if it was just attempted. And which category do we fall into? Mother asked gently. I'm not sure. Diane's voice was barely audible. I did sign documents using your power of attorney for things you hadn't actually authorized. But the will was never actually changed, and no money was transferred. I felt a chill run through me. Diane, are you saying there were other documents, not just the will? She nodded miserably. I moved some money between your accounts, Mother. Small amounts at first, just to buy time while I figured out how to handle the creditors. I always planned to put it back before anyone noticed. David's face went pale. Grandma, did you know about any account changes? Mother shook her head slowly. I stopped paying close attention to the day-to-day finances when I gave Diane the power of attorney. I trusted her to handle everything. The betrayal in Mother's voice was subtle, but unmistakable, and I saw Diane flinch at the sound of it. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "About $15,000 total," Diane whispered. "It's all still in the account I moved it to. I can transfer it back immediately." "That's not the point anymore," David said, his voice harder than I'd ever heard it. "Aunt Diane, you used legal documents to move Grandma's money without permission. That's not borrowing. That's stealing." "David," Mother said quietly, but he continued. "No, Grandma, I'm sorry, but this is serious. What if something had happened to you and we'd needed that money for your care? What if there had been an emergency?" I watched David's face as he spoke and realized this conversation was changing him too. The easygoing college student was grappling with the reality of adult consequences and family betrayal. "You're right," Diane said. "You're absolutely right, and I have no excuse. I put my own problems ahead of Mother's security, and I justified it by telling myself it was temporary." Mother stood up slowly and walked to the window overlooking her small garden. "Diane, I need you to tell me exactly which accounts you accessed and when. Everything." "Mother, I can get you all the records," Diane said quickly. "I kept track of everything because I really did intend to fix it." "That's not why I'm asking." Mother turned back to face us. "I'm asking because we need to understand the full scope of what Mr. Johnson might have to report, and what we're going to do about it." I could see the exhaustion in Mother's face, the way this revelation was aging her in real time. But underneath the tiredness, I recognized the same determination that had carried her through raising 2 daughters alone after our father died. "What do you mean, what we're going to do?" I asked. "I mean, we're going to make this right," Mother said firmly. "All of it. The moved money, the attempted will change, everything. And we're going to do it properly, through the right channels." Diane looked up sharply. "Mother, if we report this officially, there could be criminal charges. My job, my reputation—" "Should have thought of that before," David interrupted, then caught himself. "Sorry, I don't mean to be harsh, but—" "No, you're not being harsh," Diane said. "You're being honest. More honest than I've been with any of you." I found myself in the strange position of wanting to defend Diane while still being angry with her. "Mother, what exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we contact Mr. Johnson tomorrow and ask him to help us understand our options. Legal options, ethical options, all of it." "What if there aren't good options?" David asked quietly. Mother walked back to her chair and sat down heavily. "Then we'll face the consequences together. As a family." I looked around the room at these 3 people who meant everything to me, each of us changed by what had happened in the last hour. David, forced to confront the complexity of adult moral choices. Diane, finally free from the lies but facing potential ruin. Mother, betrayed by the daughter she'd trusted most, but still choosing loyalty over self-protection. And me, discovering that forgiveness and accountability didn't have to be mutually exclusive. "There's something else we need to discuss," I said slowly. "Even if we can resolve the legal issues, we need to talk about what happens next. With all of us." Diane looked at me with something that might have been hope. "What do you mean?" "I mean that regardless of what mistakes you've made, you're still my sister. And David's aunt. And Mother's daughter. But trust isn't something you can just apologize back into existence." The doorbell rang, cutting through our conversation like a knife. We all froze, looking at each other with the same thought. Mr. Johnson had returned, and our time for private family solutions might have just run out. I stood up instinctively, my heart hammering. The ring echoed through the house again, more insistent this time. Through the front window, I could see a silhouette on the porch, but the evening shadows made it impossible to identify who it was. "Should I answer it?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure why I was whispering. Mother shook her head. "Let's wait. If it's Mr. Johnson with official business, he would have called first." The doorbell rang a third time, followed by a firm knock, then silence. We sat frozen, listening to our own breathing and the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps retreating down the porch steps. "Probably just a neighbor," David said, but his voice carried the same tension we were all feeling. I realized in that moment how fragile our little bubble of family reconciliation really was. One knock at the door, one phone call, one wrong move, and everything could spiral beyond our control. The weight of that possibility settled on my chest like a stone. "This is what it's going to be like, isn't it?" I said, sinking back into my chair. "Always wondering who might be at the door? What consequences are catching up with us?" Diane had gone pale. "I never thought about that part, about how this would affect all of you, not just me." "That's been the problem all along," I said, and immediately regretted the harsh tone. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that." "No, you did mean it like that, and you're right," Diane replied. "I've been so focused on my own problems that I couldn't see past them. Even when I was trying to help Mother, I was really just trying to help myself feel less guilty about not being here more." Mother leaned forward in her chair. "Diane, guilt makes us do strange things. I understand that better than you might think." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I haven't been entirely honest either." Mother's admission hung in the air like smoke. "When I agreed to change the will, part of me was relieved." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Relieved?" "Not because I wanted to leave you nothing," Mother said quickly, reaching for my hand, "but because I was so tired of being the one who had to make fair decisions all the time." When Diane presented me with what seemed like a solution to her problems, I could tell myself I was helping rather than admitting I just wanted someone else to carry the burden of choice. I felt tears threatening again, but for different reasons this time. "Mother, you've been carrying so many burdens alone." "We all have," David said quietly. "That's what I've been watching for months. All of you trying to handle everything separately instead of together." He was right, and the realization was both comforting and devastating. Here we were, a family that loved each other deeply, and yet we'd been so isolated in our struggles. I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake worrying about Mother's health, about Diane's increasing distance, about David's future, and never once had I simply picked up the phone to say, "I'm scared and I need help." "So what do we do with that?" I asked. "How do we change it?" "Maybe we start by admitting that whatever happens with Mr. Johnson and the legal stuff, we can't go back to the way things were," Diane said. "Not the secrecy, not the trying to protect each other by handling everything alone." "That sounds terrifying," Mother said with a small laugh. "I've been protecting you girls from difficult truths for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to do anything else." I looked at David, who had been watching this conversation unfold with the careful attention he brought to everything important. "What do you think?" "You're the one who's had to watch all of us stumble around in the dark." "I think you're all braver than you give yourselves credit for," he said. "Look at what happened tonight. Diane could have kept lying, Mother could have pretended she didn't suspect anything, and you could have just accepted that families sometimes fall apart. But nobody did that. It doesn't feel brave, I admitted. It feels like we're all barely hanging on. Maybe that's what brave looks like sometimes, Mother said. Not feeling strong, but doing the right thing anyway. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, and I realized we'd been talking for hours. The adrenaline that had carried me through Diane's confession was beginning to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion mixed with something I couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, but hope tinged with uncertainty. I keep thinking about tomorrow, I said. About calling Mr. Johnson and explaining all this. What if he says Diane could go to prison? What if there's no way to fix what's been broken? Then we'll figure out how to live with that, Mother said simply. Together. Diane made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. You say that like it's easy. I don't think any of this is easy, Mother replied. But I think it's possible. David stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The car's gone. Whoever was at the door left. Good, I said, though I knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Tomorrow would bring its own complications, its own difficult conversations. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt like we were facing them as a family, instead of as 4 separate people pretending everything was fine. There's one more thing, Diane said, her voice barely above a whisper. The money I moved into my account. I can transfer it back tonight before we call Mr. Johnson. It won't fix everything, but it's a start. Do it, Mother said immediately. Not because it absolves you of what you did, but because it's the right thing to do. As Diane pulled out her phone to access her banking app, I found myself thinking about the strange mathematics of family forgiveness. It wasn't as simple as balancing scales or evening scores. It was messier than that, more complicated, and somehow more generous than I'd expected. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my blood ran cold when I saw the name on the screen. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my blood ran cold when I saw the name on the screen. David. But David was standing right there by the window, looking at me with concern as I stared at my phone. What is it? He asked, walking over. I held up my phone, showing him his name on the screen. Did you just text me? His eyebrows furrowed as he pulled out his own phone, checking it. No, I didn't send anything. What does it say? I opened the message, my hands trembling slightly. The text was garbled, just random letters and symbols. It's nothing. Just gibberish. Your phone must have sent it accidentally when you put it in your pocket. David shrugged, but I could see the stress of the evening etched in the lines around his eyes. Even he wasn't immune to the emotional toll this night had taken on all of us. The living room felt smaller somehow. The weight of our conversations pressing against the floral wallpaper that had witnessed decades of family gatherings, arguments, and reconciliations. Mother had sunk deeper into her favorite armchair, the one with the faded burgundy upholstery that she'd been threatening to reupholster for years. Her face showed the exhaustion that came not just from staying up late, but from having your world shifted on its axis. The lamplight cast gentle shadows across her features, making her look both fragile and resolute. The transfer is complete, Diane announced, her voice cutting through the comfortable silence that had settled over us. She held up her phone, showing the banking confirmation on the screen. Everything that I moved is back where it belongs. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying. It wasn't just about the money, though that mattered. It was about Diane choosing to act, to take responsibility for what she'd done. The gesture felt like a small bridge being built across the chasm that had opened between us. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. Mother reached over and patted the arm of the sofa where Diane sat. "That was the right thing to do." Diane nodded, but I could see the shame still lingering in her posture, the way she held her shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing for another blow. "It doesn't undo what I did, though. It doesn't change the fact that I was willing to steal from you, from all of us, really." "No, it doesn't," David said gently, returning to his spot on the other end of the sofa. "But it's a start, and sometimes starting is the hardest part." I looked around the room, taking in the familiar details that had always made this house feel like home. The bookshelf packed with Mother's romance novels and gardening guides, the collection of family photos spanning decades, the coffee table that still bore the ring stains from countless cups of tea during difficult conversations just like this one. "I keep thinking about what Dad would have said about all this," I admitted, surprised by my own words. We rarely talked about him anymore, not because we didn't miss him, but because the grief still felt too close to the surface sometimes. Mother's eyes softened. "He would have been heartbroken about the lying and the stealing, but he would have been proud of how we handled tonight, how we chose to be honest with each other instead of letting it fester. He would have made one of his terrible jokes to break the tension," Diane added, and for the first time all evening, there was a genuine smile in her voice. "Something about how at least we're all broke together now." David chuckled, and despite everything, I found myself laughing too. The laughter felt good, like a release valve on all the pressure that had been building. It didn't fix everything, didn't erase the hurt or the breach of trust, but it reminded us that we were still family. Still people who could find moments of lightness even in the darkness. "What happens now?" I asked, settling back into the couch cushions that had molded to accommodate thousands of family movie nights and holiday gatherings. Mother considered the question carefully, her fingers tracing the worn fabric of her chair's armrest. "Now we rebuild. It won't happen overnight, and it won't be easy. Trust is like a vase. Once it's broken, even when you glue it back together, you can still see the cracks." "But maybe the cracks don't have to be ugly," Diane said quietly. "Maybe they can remind us to be more careful with each other." I studied my sister's face in the soft lamplight. The defiance that had characterized so much of her adult life seemed to have drained away, replaced by something rawer and more vulnerable. She looked younger somehow, like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "I want to understand," I said. "Not to excuse what you did, but to understand how we got here. How did things get so bad that you felt like you had no other choice?" Diane was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisted in her lap. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the background, marking time while we all waited for her to find the words. "I felt invisible," she finally said. "You were always the responsible one, the one who did everything right. You have your career, your life together. David has always been the peacekeeper, the one everyone turns to. And I was just the mess, the one who couldn't get it together." "Diane," Mother started, but my sister held up a hand. "Let me finish. When you started getting sick, Mom, and we began talking about the will and what would happen, I panicked. I thought about how everyone would judge me, how they'd assume I'd just waste whatever I inherited, and I started thinking maybe I should take control of the situation before you decided I didn't deserve anything." The honesty in her words was like a physical blow. I had never realized how my own successes might have felt like a judgment to her, how the very stability I'd worked so hard to build had become a mirror, reflecting back her own insecurities. "I never thought of you as a mess," I said. "Frustrating sometimes, yes, but not a mess. You're creative and passionate and brave in ways I've never been able to be. Really? The question came out small and uncertain. Really, I've always envied how you could throw yourself into things completely, how you weren't afraid to fail. I play everything safe, maybe too safe. David leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. Maybe that's part of the problem. We've all been so focused on our individual roles in this family that we forgot to really see each other. I'm the peacekeeper, so I avoid conflict even when it needs to happen. You're the responsible one, so you shoulder everything alone. Diane's the free spirit, so we don't trust her with serious things. Mom's the matriarch, so she tries to protect everyone else's feelings instead of expressing her own. The truth of his words settled over us like a blanket, heavy, but somehow comforting. We had been playing these roles for so long that they'd become cages, limiting how we saw ourselves and each other. So what do we do differently? Mother asked. We start by talking, I said. Really talking, not just checking in and pretending everything's fine. We tell each other when we're struggling instead of trying to handle everything alone. And we ask for help, Diane added, even when it's embarrassing or hard. And we make room for people to change, David said, looking at each of us in turn. We don't keep people trapped in old patterns just because it's easier than adjusting our expectations. I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of possibility, of the strange hope that comes when you realize that the thing you thought was broken might actually be fixable. I love you all, I said, the words coming out thick with emotion. Even when we hurt each other, even when we make terrible choices, I love you. The responses came in a chorus of, I love you too, and for a moment, the living room felt full of something precious and fragile and worth fighting for. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and reminding us that the world beyond our small circle continued to turn. But inside, we had carved out a space for honesty, for forgiveness, for the slow work of healing that lay ahead. Tomorrow, we would call the lawyer. We would figure out the legal implications of what Diane had done. We would probably have more difficult conversations, more moments of doubt and frustration. But tonight, we had chosen each other. And that felt like enough.